There is a particular kind of empire that falls without the thunder of artillery or the clash of cavalry charges. It dies in mahogany-paneled offices where men in frock coats slide documents across polished desks. It bleeds out, not on battlefields, but in ledger books, one interest payment at a time. The Ottoman Empire, a colossus that had besieged Vienna, controlled 3 continents and made Christian Europe tremble for half a millennium, met its end not at the point of a sword, but at the tip of a pen dipped in red ink. This is the chronicle of history's most elegant conquest, a masterclass in financial warfare that transformed creditors into colonizers and turned compound interest into a weapon more devastating than any cannonball. It is the story of how Britain, France, and Germany dismembered an empire without firing a shot, and in doing so, invented the modern debt trap, a template that would be replicated from Latin America to Africa to Asia for the next 150 years. The mechanics of this financial strangulation were so effective, so ruthlessly efficient, that by the time the Ottomans realized what was happening, the shackles were already locked. What follows is not merely a history lesson, but a warning label attached to the very concept of sovereign debt, written in the blood of an empire that borrowed itself into oblivion. The magnificent illusion. To comprehend the magnitude of the fall, you must first understand the height from which the Ottomans descended. In 1850, the empire still commanded an expanse that would make most modern superpowers envious. From the fog-shrouded peaks of the Balkans to the sun-scorched sands of Arabia, from the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coastlines of North Africa, the Sultan's dominion stretched across lands where a dozen civilizations had risen and fallen. Istanbul, the jewel of the Bosphorus, the city that straddled 2 continents, was a metropolis that rivaled any European capital. The Hagia Sophia's dome still dominated the skyline, 1,000 years old and defiant. The Grand Bazaar hummed with merchants trading silk from China, spices from India, and coffee from Yemen. The Sultan's court glittered with ceremonial splendor that made European monarchs look like provincial governors. But this grandeur was a facade, a gilded mask covering a face ravaged by economic disease. While the smokestacks of Manchester and the steam engines of Liverpool were propelling Britain into the industrial age, while Parisian workshops were perfecting precision manufacturing, the Ottoman economy remained locked in a feudal time capsule. Agriculture dominated, employing methods that would have been familiar to farmers in the Byzantine era. The great cities of the empire produced textiles by hand, metalwork in small forges, goods crafted one at a time by artisans whose techniques hadn't evolved in centuries. The tax system was a Byzantine labyrinth of corruption and inefficiency. Provincial governors, known as pashas, ruled their territories like personal fiefdoms. Tax collectors, often tax farmers who had purchased the right to extract revenue from a region, squeezed the peasantry mercilessly while pocketing substantial portions before forwarding anything to Istanbul. By the time silver reached the Sultan's treasury, half of it had evaporated into the pockets of middlemen, corrupt officials, and regional strongmen who operated with near impunity. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had balanced their budgets through time-tested, if brutal, methods. Debasing the currency by mixing base metals into silver coins, confiscating the estates of wealthy officials on flimsy pretexts, and occasionally raiding the treasuries of newly conquered territories. These were the financial tricks of medieval autocracy, and they had worked adequately when the empire was expanding and when its enemies were similarly primitive. But the world had changed. The Industrial Revolution had fundamentally altered the mathematics of power. A nation's strength was no longer measured merely in square miles of territory or numbers of cavalry. It was measured in steel production, railway miles, coal tonnage, and industrial output. The Ottomans were trying to compete in a modern arms race with a medieval treasury, and they were losing ground with each passing year. The Russian Empire, that perpetual nemesis looming to the north, was modernizing its army with Western technology. The British controlled sea lanes with a navy powered by steam and iron. Even small European nations could field better-equipped armies than the once mighty Ottoman military. The Sultan and his advisors could feel the ground shifting beneath them. They needed capital, massive amounts of it, to transform their realm from an agrarian backwater into a modern power capable of defending itself in this new world order. And there was only one place to get that capital: the financial markets of Western Europe. The first taste of poison, the decision to borrow, was not made lightly. Islamic law traditionally prohibited riba, usury, or the charging of interest. And though Ottoman jurists had found various workarounds over the centuries for commercial purposes, taking interest-bearing loans from Christian powers was something else entirely. It was both religiously dubious and politically dangerous. The collective memory of the Ottoman elite contained plenty of examples of what happened when Islamic states became financially dependent on European Christians. Subjugation followed, as surely as dawn follows darkness. But necessity is a harsh negotiator, and in 1853, necessity arrived in the form of Russian armies, crossing into Ottoman territory, igniting the Crimean War. This conflict would prove to be a watershed moment, not for its military outcomes, though tens of thousands would die in the frozen trenches of Sevastopol, but for its financial consequences. The Russians were pressing into the Balkans and threatening the very heart of the empire. Sultan Abdülmecid faced the prospect of watching his realm dismembered unless he could field an army capable of matching the Russian war machine. His treasury, however, was catastrophically empty. The war's cost was measured in millions of Ottoman gold liras, figures that exceeded the entire annual revenue of the state. Britain and France, alarmed at the prospect of Russian expansion threatening their own interests in the Mediterranean and the route to India, decided to intervene. They dispatched armies and fleets to aid the Ottomans, but soldiers and sailors needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. The commanders who arrived in Istanbul made it clear: if the Sultan wanted their continued support, he would need to contribute financially to his own defense. This created an impossible situation. The Ottoman state needed money to wage a war that was bankrupting it, but it had no money to fight the war. The circle was vicious and tightening. Enter the bankers. In 1854, representatives from a syndicate of British and French financial houses arrived in Istanbul with a proposal. They would lend the Sultan £3 million, an astronomical sum equivalent to approximately £400 million in modern terms. The money would flow immediately, allowing the war to continue. The Sultan would repay the loan over time with interest. On the surface, it seemed like salvation, but the devil, as always, resided in the details. The loan was issued at 80% of its face value, but carried interest obligations on the full 100%. This meant that for every £100 of debt the Ottoman government assumed, it actually received only £80 in usable cash. The remaining £20 went immediately to the bankers as commission, fees, and risk premium. Yet the interest, calculated at 6% annually, applied to the full £100 downs. The mathematics of this arrangement were quietly devastating. The effective interest rate, when you calculated it based on the actual money received, was closer to 7.5%, and this didn't account for the additional fees, the exchange rate manipulations, and various other charges that the bankers buried in the fine print of the contract. But Sultan Abdulmecid, desperate and surrounded by advisors who lacked financial sophistication, signed the papers. The money arrived in Istanbul like a miracle. Gold flowed from London and Paris into the Ottoman treasury. Suddenly, soldiers could be paid, munitions could be purchased, and ships could be provisioned. The immediate crisis was averted. The Crimean War eventually ended in 1856 with a victory for the Ottoman-British-French coalition. The Russians were pushed back, and the empire's territorial integrity was preserved, at least for the moment. But the true cost of that victory was just beginning to compound. Because the Sultan and his court had discovered something intoxicating, the magic of credit. The addiction begins. The ease with which that first loan had materialized left an indelible impression on the Ottoman elite. With a simple signature, with a promise to pay later, vast sums of gold could be conjured into existence and put to immediate use. It seemed like alchemy, like something for nothing. The fact that it wasn't something for nothing, that every lira borrowed would have to be repaid with interest, somehow failed to register in the euphoric aftermath of survival. The empire's leadership looked westward with a mixture of envy and aspiration. They saw London with its gaslights and its vast parks, its imposing government buildings, and its efficient transportation networks. They saw Paris with its grand boulevards, its opera houses, its monuments to civilized modernity. They saw Vienna and Berlin rising as centers of culture and power. And they looked at Istanbul, ancient, exotic, but increasingly shabby in comparison, and felt a burning need to prove themselves worthy of membership in this club of great powers. The problem was that the Ottomans wanted to purchase the appearance of modernity rather than build its foundations. Instead of investing borrowed capital into the unglamorous but essential work of establishing factories, developing mining operations, building agricultural infrastructure, or creating educational institutions that could train engineers and scientists, they spent it on spectacle. Sultan Abdulaziz, who succeeded his brother Abdulmecid in 1861, was particularly susceptible to this vanity. He was a man of grandiose tastes and even more grandiose insecurities. He felt the condescension of European royalty when he visited their capitals, saw how they viewed the Ottomans as exotic and backward, and determined to prove them wrong through conspicuous consumption. His first major project was the Dolmabahce Palace, a building that would stand as the ultimate symbol of Ottoman delusion. The old Topkapi Palace, where sultans had resided for 4 centuries, was deemed insufficiently impressive, too Asian, too traditional, too old-fashioned for a ruler who wanted to be accepted as a peer by European monarchs. So Abdulaziz commissioned architects to build a palace that would eclipse Versailles itself. The result was a monument to excess that defied fiscal sanity. The Dolmabahce Palace consumed 14 tons of gold leaf in its decoration. Its main ceremonial hall featured a chandelier, a gift from Queen Victoria, that weighed 5 tons and contained 750 lamps, making it the largest crystal chandelier in the world. The grand staircase was constructed entirely of baccarat crystal. Silk carpets, woven by hand, covered floors made of Italian marble. Every room dripped with wealth, gold-painted ceilings, walls covered in hand-painted porcelain tiles, furniture inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The palace cost 5 million gold liras, roughly 1/4 of the empire's entire annual tax revenue, and it was built entirely with borrowed money. But the palace was just the beginning. Abdulaziz looked at the British Royal Navy and decided he needed one too. He began ordering ironclad warships from British shipyards, the latest military technology of the age. He purchased state-of-the-art Krupp cannons from Germany. For a brief period, the Ottoman Navy was nominally the third largest in the world. Yet there was no money to fuel these ships or maintain them. Many of the magnificent warships sat in the Golden Horn, their hulls gradually rusting, their boilers cold, their guns never fired except in ceremonial salutes. They were floating piles of debt, as useless as they were expensive. To finance this spending spree, the Ottoman government returned again and again to the European capital markets. In 1855, they borrowed again. In 1858, another loan. In 1860, 1862, 1863, 1865, the borrowing became a pattern, then a habit, then an addiction. The bankers in London and Paris were more than happy to accommodate. Each loan generated enormous fees and commissions. The interest rates were lucrative, and most importantly, the bankers had calculated that the Ottoman Empire was too big to fail. It controlled the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a geographic choke point of enormous strategic importance. It sat astride the land routes to India and the Persian Gulf. Britain and France would never allow it to collapse entirely because its territory was too valuable, too critical to European interests. This was moral hazard in its purest form. The bankers took risks they knew were excessive because they believed the governments of Britain and France would ultimately bail them out if things went wrong. They were betting with other people's money on a game they thought was rigged in their favor. The Ponzi scheme emerges by the mid-1860s. The Ottoman financial situation had devolved into what any modern economist would immediately recognize as a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire was no longer borrowing to invest. It was borrowing to service previous borrowing. The interest payments on the accumulated debt began to devour an ever larger share of the annual budget. In 1860, perhaps 15% of Ottoman government revenue went to debt service, uncomfortable but manageable. By 1865, that figure had climbed to 30%. By 1870, it exceeded 50%. Think carefully about what this means. More than half of every lira collected from farmers, fishermen, merchants, and craftsmen across the empire, money extracted through taxation that was already harsh, was immediately leaving the country. It flowed out of Istanbul, crossed the Mediterranean, and landed in the accounts of bondholders in London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Vienna. The Ottoman people were working, in effect, for foreign creditors. This left virtually nothing for the actual governance and defense of the empire. There was no money to pay soldiers adequately, no money to maintain roads, no money to fund education, no money to build the industrial infrastructure that might have generated real economic growth. The state was being hollowed out, its resources extracted, its future mortgaged. To bridge the gaps between the large European loans, which took months to arrange, the Ottoman government turned increasingly to a group of local financiers, known as the Galata bankers. These were primarily Armenian and Greek families who operated from the Galata district of Istanbul, the financial heart of the city. They served as the Ottoman government's loan sharks. When the treasury ran dry mid-year, when soldiers' wages were 2 months overdue, when a crisis demanded immediate cash, the Grand Vizier would cross the Golden Horn to Galata and beg for short-term loans. The Galata bankers, understanding that the government was desperate and had no alternatives, charged rates that would make modern payday lenders blush: 18%, 20%, sometimes 25% annual interest for loans that lasted only a few months. It was a death spiral. The government borrowed at usurious short-term rates to stay afloat until the next large European loan could be arranged. But those European loans were increasingly being used just to pay off the Galata bankers and service the interest on previous European loans. No money was flowing to productive uses. The empire was treading water while wearing an anchor. The bankers in London and Paris were not blind to this deterioration. They could read the financial statements. They could see that the Ottoman government's ability to repay was crumbling, but they kept lending anyway, because each new loan generated immediate fees and because they still believed that when the crisis finally came, the great powers would intervene to protect their investments. The perfect storm, the collapse when it came, arrived with the force of multiple catastrophes converging simultaneously. In 1873, a financial panic originated in Vienna following the collapse of the stock market. The contagion spread rapidly across Europe and jumped the Atlantic to America, triggering what would be known as the Long Depression, an economic crisis that would last, in various forms, until 1879. Banks failed, credit markets froze, capital that had been flowing relatively freely suddenly dried up completely. The European financial institutions that had been happily lending to the Ottomans abruptly stopped. The music had ended, and there were no longer any chairs. At precisely this moment, nature decided to compound the disaster. In 1873 and 1874, a catastrophic drought struck Anatolia, the heartland of the empire. Crops withered in the fields, livestock perished, wells ran dry. The peasants, who formed the tax base of the entire imperial system, faced starvation. Ottoman tax collectors, backed by gendarmes, rode into villages across Anatolia demanding payment. They found skeletal farmers with nothing to give. The famine was so severe that in some regions people resorted to eating grass and tree bark. The death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands, and the tax revenue, which the government was counting on to service its debts, simply evaporated. The Grand Vizier, Mahmud Nadim Pasha, sat in his office in Istanbul looking at ledgers that told a story of arithmetic impossibility. There was a massive bond payment due to European creditors in October 1875. The amount required was millions of liras. The amount in the treasury was essentially zero. He sent emissaries to Paris and London to negotiate yet another loan. They returned with rejections. The markets were closed. No one would lend a single penny to the Ottomans. The empire faced an impossible choice: starve its own people, to pay foreign bankers, or default. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued what became known as the Muharrem Decree. It was phrased in the careful language of diplomacy, describing a temporary adjustment to debt service obligations. But the reality was stark. The government announced it would pay only 50% of scheduled debt payments in cash. The remaining 50% would be paid in new bonds carrying a 5% interest rate. In the sanitized terminology of international finance, this was called a moratorium or a restructuring. In plain language, it was a sovereign default. The Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt. The predator's circle. The reaction in Europe was immediate and furious. Tens of thousands of middle-class investors across Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Germany had purchased Ottoman bonds because they offered attractive yields, higher than domestic government bonds, but backed by what they believed was a stable, if exotic, empire. Shopkeepers, clergymen, military officers, widows living on fixed incomes, all had trusted their savings to Ottoman paper. Overnight, those bonds became worth a fraction of their face value. Newspaper editorials across Europe screamed that the Turks were thieves and liars. Political cartoons depicted the Sultan as a turbaned villain stealing from honest Christians. The diplomatic goodwill that Britain and France had extended to the Ottomans, protecting them against Russian aggression for strategic reasons, evaporated. The default sent a clear signal to every predatory power that had been eyeing Ottoman territory. The Sultan was broke, weak, and politically isolated. The empire was ripe for dismemberment. The Russian Empire, which had been restrained since the Crimean War by the threat of British and French intervention, saw an opportunity too good to pass up. In April 1877, Tsar Alexander II declared war, sending his armies south across the Danube into the Balkans and east into the Caucasus. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78 was a catastrophe of the first order for the Ottomans. The army, unpaid for months, under-equipped, and demoralized, fought bravely but was systematically defeated. Russian forces advanced to within sight of Istanbul, their artillery positioned on hills from which they could see the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The Ottoman government, in desperation, considered abandoning the capital and fleeing to Anatolia. Only the intervention of Britain, which feared Russian control of Istanbul and the Straits would upset the entire European balance of power, saved the empire from complete annihilation. The British fleet steamed through the Dardanelles and anchored off Istanbul, sending a clear message to the Russians that further advance would mean war with Britain. The Treaty of San Stefano, signed in March 1878, stripped the Ottoman Empire of vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained independence. Bulgaria emerged as a large autonomous state under Russian influence. The Ottomans lost control of lands their predecessors had conquered 400 years earlier. But the most devastating clause wasn't territorial. It was financial. The Russians imposed a crushing war indemnity, 1.4 billion francs, to be paid as compensation for the costs of the war. This sum was utterly beyond the capacity of the bankrupt Ottoman state to pay. Now, the empire owed hundreds of millions to the European bondholders it had defaulted on, plus this massive new debt to Russia. The total debt load exceeded the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The state was technically insolvent several times over. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had ascended to the throne in 1876 in the midst of this crisis, sat in Yildiz Palace. He had abandoned the Dolmabahce Palace as too exposed and awaited the final dismemberment of his realm. He had suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and established an autocratic regime, believing that only centralized control could save what remained of the empire. But even autocracy couldn't conjure money from air. The European powers, however, had a more sophisticated plan than simple conquest, the mechanism of soft conquest. The representatives who arrived in Istanbul in 1881 were not generals in gold-braided uniforms, but bankers in dark suits carrying leather briefcases filled with documents. They represented the bondholders of Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands, the creditor nations whose citizens had purchased Ottoman debt. They came with a proposal that was as elegant as it was ruthless. These men understood that directly annexing Ottoman territory would be problematic. Military occupation was expensive, required maintaining armies in hostile territory, and invited diplomatic complications with other European powers who would object to one nation gaining too much. Governing millions of Muslims would be politically difficult and potentially trigger rebellions. But what if they could control the empire without governing it? What if they could extract wealth continuously without the burden of administration? The negotiations that followed produced the Muharrem Decree of December 1881, a document that would fundamentally alter the nature of Ottoman sovereignty. It established an organization unprecedented in the history of empire, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, known by its French acronym as OPDA, Administration de la Dette Publique Ottomane. The OPDA was not an Ottoman government agency. It was a foreign-controlled corporation with extraordinary legal powers. Its governing council consisted of representatives appointed by the bondholders of the major European creditor nations. This council answered not to the Sultan, but to the financiers of Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. The decree handed over to this foreign entity direct control over the empire's most lucrative revenue streams. The Sultan's government agreed, though agreed is perhaps too strong a word for what was essentially a diktat imposed on a bankrupt state with no negotiating power, to transfer the collection rights for numerous taxes. All revenue from the salt monopoly, all revenue from the tobacco monopoly, all revenue from silk production, stamp duties on all legal documents, excise taxes on spirits, fishing taxes across the empire, revenue from the tribute paid by several autonomous regions. These were not marginal revenue sources. These were among the most reliable and productive taxes in the entire Ottoman system. Salt was a necessity of life. Every household, no matter how poor, needed to purchase it. Tobacco was consumed across all social classes. Silk was one of the empire's primary exports. The OPDA constructed its own parallel bureaucracy to collect these taxes. It hired over 5,000 employees, tax collectors, auditors, inspectors, and administrators. These men wore distinctive uniforms that marked them as agents of the OPDA, rather than the Ottoman state. They carried authority derived not from the Sultan, but from the European bondholders. They were armed and empowered to enforce collection. These tax collectors fanned out across the empire, from the Balkans to Syria, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. They established offices in every major city and many smaller towns. When a fisherman on the Aegean caught his daily haul and brought it to market, an OPDA agent would be waiting to collect the tax. When a farmer in Bursa harvested silk cocoons, the OPDA would take its share. When a merchant in Salonika purchased legal stamps for his documents, the revenue went to the OPDA. The OPDA built a headquarters in Istanbul that was both a fortress and a symbol. The Karaköy building, a massive stone structure that loomed over the waterfront, visible from across the Golden Horn. It was a physical manifestation of who truly controlled the empire's finances, and the OPDA was ruthlessly efficient in ways the Ottoman government had never been. It employed modern European accounting practices. It standardized procedures. It rooted out corruption among its own employees. It invested in infrastructure that would increase revenue, building better salt refineries, distributing disease-resistant silkworm eggs to farmers, improving warehouse systems. But it did all this not to benefit the Ottoman economy or the Ottoman people. Every improvement was calculated to maximize the revenue that could be extracted and sent abroad. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected approximately one-third of the total revenue generated by the Ottoman economy. Think about this extraordinary figure. 1 out of every 3 liras earned anywhere in the empire ended up in the hands of this foreign-controlled entity. That money was used to service the old debts, paying interest to bondholders in European capitals. The Ottoman government, the actual state apparatus responsible for defending the territory, maintaining order, building infrastructure, providing services, was left with only 2/3 of its own tax base. It had to maintain an army, run a civil administration, and attempt to modernize a vast empire with only 67% of the revenue that was generated within its borders. This guaranteed perpetual Ottoman weakness. There was never enough money to build the factories that might have industrialized the economy, never enough to fund widespread education that might have trained engineers and scientists, never enough to construct the railways and roads that might have unified the territory economically. The empire was trapped in underdevelopment because the surplus capital that might have funded growth was being continuously extracted to service old debts. The death spiral accelerates. The Sultan and Abdulhamid II reigned but did not truly rule in the realm of finance. If he wanted to fund a school system, he had to ask the OPDA if any money remained after debt service. Usually, the answer was no. If he wanted to build a strategic railway, he had to seek foreign loans, which meant going hat in hand to the same European powers who controlled the OPDA. This is where a new player entered the game with devastating consequences: Imperial Germany. While Britain and France were content to slowly bleed the Ottomans through the debt mechanism, German Kaiser Wilhelm II saw a strategic opportunity. Germany was the newest of the great powers, unified only in 1871, and it was desperate to catch up to Britain and France in the colonial race. The Ottoman Empire represented a chance to gain influence in the Middle East without the expense of conquest. Wilhelm visited Istanbul in 1898, making a great show of friendship with the Sultan. He gave speeches declaring Germany to be the friend of the world's Muslims, a power that would help the Ottomans modernize rather than exploit them like the British and French were doing. He embraced Abdulhamid and spoke of partnership. The centerpiece of this partnership was to be the Baghdad Railway, a monumental project that would connect Berlin to Baghdad and potentially all the way to the Persian Gulf. The strategic implications were enormous. It would allow Germany to bypass the British-controlled Suez Canal. It would provide access to the oil fields that were beginning to be discovered in Mesopotamia. It would allow the rapid movement of troops to suppress rebellions or defend against invasion. For the Sultan, the railway seemed like salvation. It would help him move forces quickly to control the restive provinces. It would stimulate economic development. It would tie the empire to a powerful military ally who might protect it against Britain, France, and Russia. But the question remained, who would pay for it? The Ottoman treasury, controlled by the OPDA and bled dry by debt service, had no money for such a project. The Germans had an answer. Deutsche Bank would finance it through loans. And so another cycle of borrowing began, but this time with even more predatory terms. The German contracts for the Baghdad Railway included kilometric guarantees, a clause stipulating that the Ottoman government had to pay the German construction companies a guaranteed profit for every kilometre of track laid, regardless of whether the railway ever carried a single passenger or ton of freight. Additionally, the contracts granted German companies exclusive rights to all oil and mineral deposits discovered within a 20-kilometre corridor on either side of the tracks. The Ottomans were signing away potential resource wealth they didn't even know they had yet. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire had effectively become an economic colony of Germany. German military advisors were reorganizing the army. German engineers were running major infrastructure projects. Deutsche Bank held the newest tranche of Ottoman debt. German firms had concessions throughout the empire. The British and French watched this with growing alarm and anger. They saw their financial control, exercised through the OPDA, being undermined by German influence. They saw Germany positioning itself to dominate the Middle East. The debt of the sick man of Europe had become a cause of friction among the great powers, one factor among many pushing Europe toward catastrophe. The final gamble. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the Ottoman leadership, now controlled by the Young Turk movement that had seized power in a coup, faced a moment of reckoning. They understood that as long as the empire remained indebted and under the financial control of foreign powers, it was not truly independent. They made a calculated gamble. They would ally with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. If the Central Powers won, the Ottomans could cancel their debts to Britain and France, dissolve the hated OPDA, expel the foreign tax collectors, and regain financial sovereignty. It was a bet the empire wager. On November 14, 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war. One of the first acts of the Ottoman government was to march to the OPDA headquarters in Istanbul and expel the British and French representatives. They suspended all debt payments to the Allied powers. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the empire felt free of its shackles, but the gamble failed spectacularly. The war was an unmitigated disaster for the Ottomans. Their armies were defeated on multiple fronts, in the Caucasus by the Russians, in Palestine and Syria by the British, in Mesopotamia by British and Indian forces, in Gallipoli at horrific cost, even in victory. The empire hemorrhaged blood and treasure in a war it could not afford to fight. When the armistice came in October 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, occupied, and dismembered. British and French forces occupied Istanbul. Allied warships filled the Bosphorus. The Sultan was a puppet. The territory that had once stretched across 3 continents was carved into pieces by the victors. But through all this destruction, through the death of empires and the redrawing of maps, one thing survived: the debt. The debt that refused to die. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk emerged from the ashes of the empire to forge the Turkish Republic in 1923, after a brutal war of independence against occupying powers, the representatives of European creditors were waiting with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, which established the borders and international status of the new Turkish state, British and French negotiators insisted on a clause addressing the Ottoman debt. They argued that Turkey, as the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, was legally obligated to assume responsibility for the debts. You inherited the territory, they said. Therefore, you inherit the mortgage. Ataturk fought against this vigorously. The debts, he argued, had been incurred by the Sultanate to buy palaces and warships that no longer existed, to fight wars that had destroyed his nation, to enrich European bankers, who had knowingly lent money to a corrupt regime. Why should the new republic, poor and devastated by a decade of continuous warfare, be responsible for the follies of dead sultans? But the Europeans were adamant. If Turkey wanted to be part of the international economic system, if it wanted trade relations, if it wanted any hope of development loans in the future, it would have to acknowledge the debts. The alternative was to be treated as a pariah state, cut off from global commerce. Ataturk, pragmatist that he was, eventually agreed to a compromise. The debt was restructured, reduced somewhat, and the payment terms were made more manageable. But the principle was established. Turkey would pay. And so the Turkish Republic, struggling to build a nation from ruins, spent its first 3 decades sending millions of dollars annually abroad, paying for the reckless borrowing of Ottoman sultans from the 1850s through 1914. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954, exactly a century after the first loan was taken to fight the Crimean War. 100 years, 3 generations of Turks who had nothing to do with Dolmabahce Palace or ironclad warships or Baghdad railways, paying for decisions made by men long dead. The template of conquest. The destruction of the Ottoman Empire through debt was not merely a historical curiosity or a unique case of imperial overreach. It was a prototype, a template that would be refined and replicated across the globe for the next 150 years. The mechanics were perfect in their simplicity. Lend money to a developing nation, desperate for capital and modernization. Charge high interest rates, justified by the risk. When the country struggles to pay, offer new loans to service the old debt. When it finally defaults, create an international financial institution to seize control of key revenue sources. Extract wealth continuously while the country remains formally independent. This pattern would be repeated in Latin America throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. It would be applied to China, where European powers established foreign control over Chinese maritime customs after the Qing dynasty's default. It would emerge again in the debt crises that swept through Africa and Latin America in the 1980s, when structural adjustment programs gave international financial institutions extraordinary control over national economic policies. The Ottoman case was the original, the proof of concept that demonstrated you didn't need to plant your flag over a foreign capital to dominate it. You simply needed to hold its debt. The British and French didn't need to garrison Istanbul with regiments of soldiers. They didn't need to appoint governors or administrators. They simply installed a corporate entity, the OPDA, staffed by accountants and tax collectors, and extracted wealth more efficiently than any military occupation could have achieved. This was conquest by compound interest, colonization by accounting ledger, empire built not on gunpowder but on paperwork. The eternal lesson, the Ottoman tragedy, contains a lesson that echoes across the centuries, as relevant today as it was in 1854 when Sultan Abdulmajid signed that first loan agreement. Sovereignty and solvency are inseparable. A nation that does not control its own finances cannot truly control its own destiny. Every loan agreement is not merely a financial transaction, but a transfer of power. Every interest payment is not just money leaving the country, but leverage entering it. The creditor who holds enough of your debt doesn't need to threaten you with invasion. They simply need to remind you of the payment schedule. The Ottomans made a series of catastrophic miscalculations that compounded into their destruction. First, they borrowed for consumption rather than production. Palaces and warships are impressive symbols of power, but they generate no return on investment. Had the borrowed capital been channeled into building textile factories, establishing technical schools, developing mining operations, or constructing profitable infrastructure, the loans might have paid for themselves through increased economic output. Instead, the money was spent on spectacle, beautiful, impressive, and economically sterile. Second, they failed to understand compound interest as a weapon of conquest. The Ottoman officials who signed those early loan agreements saw them as emergency measures, temporary expedients to solve immediate crises. They didn't grasp that at 6 to 7% annual interest, debt doubles every decade. They didn't understand that once you begin borrowing to pay interest on previous loans, you have entered a mathematical trap from which there is no escape except through default or absolute fiscal discipline. And fiscal discipline was impossible when half the budget was already committed to debt service. Third, they trusted that geopolitical importance would protect them. The Ottomans believed that because they controlled the straits, because their territory was strategically vital, the European powers would never allow them to fail completely. This belief was simultaneously correct and catastrophically wrong. Yes, Britain and France prevented Russia from conquering Istanbul, but they didn't save the Ottoman Empire. They preserved it as a financial colony, kept alive just long enough to be milked dry. Fourth, they allowed foreign control of domestic revenue. The establishment of the OPDA was the moment sovereignty died, even though the flag still flew over Istanbul. Once foreign entities controlled the collection of taxes, the fundamental prerogative of statehood, everything else was theater. The Sultan might sit on his throne, his officials might wear their ceremonial robes, but the real power was in the hands of European bondholders who could strangle the state by simply refusing to release any funds for non-debt purposes. The modern world is littered with echoes of the Ottoman pattern. Sri Lanka, unable to service Chinese loans, handed over the port of Hambantota on a 99-year lease in 2017, a debt-for-equity swap that gave China control of strategic infrastructure. Greece, drowning in debt after the 2008 financial crisis, was forced to accept a troika of international creditors who effectively dictated national economic policy, imposing austerity measures that the Greek government was powerless to resist. Zambia, having borrowed heavily from Chinese lenders for infrastructure projects, faced the prospect of losing control of its national power company when it struggled to meet payments. The pattern persists because it works. It's elegant, efficient, and largely invisible to populations who don't understand the relationship between sovereign debt and national autonomy. There are no troops to photograph, no colonial administrators to protest against, just accountants and spreadsheets and debt service obligations that must be met regardless of what the people want or need. The ghosts. In the ledger today, if you walk through Istanbul, you can still see the physical remnants of this financial tragedy. The Dolmabahce Palace stands on the shores of the Bosphorus, its crystal chandeliers still sparkling, its gold leaf still gleaming, a monument to vanity that cost an empire its independence. Tourists marvel at its beauty without knowing they're looking at the most expensive mistake in Ottoman history. The OPDA headquarters in Karaköy still stands, though it now houses other institutions. The building remains imposing, a fortress-like structure that dominated the waterfront, a constant reminder to anyone in Istanbul of who truly controlled the city's wealth during those final decades of the empire. The Baghdad Railway, that German project, which pulled the Ottomans into World War I, was eventually completed, though not until after the empire had ceased to exist. Trains still run on sections of that track, carrying goods and passengers through territories that are now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, three separate nations carved from the corpse of the empire that bankrupted itself to build the line. But perhaps the most haunting remnant is not physical, but institutional. The debt itself paid off finally in 1954, linking generations across a century. A Turkish citizen making a tax payment in 1950 was, in some small part, paying for Sultan Abdulaziz's crystal staircase from 1865, the dead hand of the past, reaching forward through compound interest, extracting payment from the future for the mistakes of history. The question that remains: the Ottoman Empire's destruction by debt raises an uncomfortable question that resonates into our present age. Is there a difference between conquest and colonization if the end result, loss of sovereignty, extraction of wealth, foreign control of policy, is identical? The British like to think of themselves as different from, say, the Spanish conquistadors. They didn't commit genocide, didn't enslave populations en masse, didn't destroy civilizations for gold. They used loans, treaties, corporations, and accounting. They conquered with the appearance of consent, with signed documents and legal frameworks. But from the perspective of the conquered, does the method matter if the outcome is the same? The Ottoman peasant, whose tax payment was seized by an OPDA agent and sent to London, was experiencing extraction just as surely as if a foreign soldier had demanded tribute at gunpoint. The difference was merely aesthetic. This is the true genius and true horror of financial conquest. It maintains the fiction of independence while hollowing out its substance. The flag still flies. The anthem still plays. The government still meets and passes laws, but the fundamental decisions, how to allocate resources, what to invest in, how to balance present needs against future obligations, are no longer made by the nation itself, but by creditors sitting in foreign capitals, consulting spreadsheets that show debt to GDP ratios and interest coverage metrics. The modern resonance. We live in an age of unprecedented global debt. National governments collectively owe more than $80 trillion. This debt is denominated in currencies they don't control, owed to creditors in other countries, secured against future tax revenue that hasn't been collected yet from citizens not yet born. The architects of this system insist it's different from what happened to the Ottomans. The loans today are used for development, they say. The international financial institutions have safeguards and oversight. The world is more interconnected, more sophisticated, more humane, perhaps. But the mathematics of compound interest hasn't changed. The power dynamics of debtor and creditor remain as asymmetric as they were in 1854. And history suggests that when push comes to shove, when a nation cannot pay, the creditors will find a way to extract their value, if not in cash, then in control. The Ottoman Empire thought it was borrowing money to become modern, to join the ranks of great powers, to build a future worthy of its glorious past. Instead, it borrowed itself into submission, into irrelevance, and ultimately into extinction. The ledger books that recorded those transactions are long since archived, the bankers who profited from them long since buried, the empire they dismembered long since swept into history. But the lesson they contain remains fresh, carved not in stone, but in red ink. Every loan is a chain, every debt is a claim on the future, and sovereignty, once mortgaged, is rarely redeemed except at catastrophic cost. The Ottoman Empire learned this lesson slowly, painfully, over the course of 7 decades. They paid for their education with territory, dignity, and ultimately their existence as a state. The final payment was made in 1954, but the cost, the true cost, cannot be calculated in any currency. It is measured in the maps that were redrawn, the nations that were created and destroyed, the millions who died in wars, fought over the corpse of an empire that had starved itself to feed foreign creditors. This is how empires die in the modern age, not with the sound of trumpets and the clash of armies, but with the scratch of a pen, signing a loan agreement, the gentle rustle of papers in a banker's office, and the steady, inexorable accumulation of compound interest, the most powerful force in human affairs, more destructive than any army, more permanent than any conquest. The Ottomans discovered too late that the banker's pen was mightier than the soldier's sword, and that in the mathematics of debt there is no mercy, no sentiment, no consideration of past glory or present suffering, only the cold calculation of principal plus interest, compounding endlessly until the debtor has nothing left to give but the keys to their own kingdom. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is not merely history, it is prophecy. It shows us the future that awaits any nation that confuses borrowing with building, that mistakes the appearance of wealth for its reality, that believes international goodwill will protect it from the consequences of insolvency. In the end, the lesson is written clearly in the ruins of empires. You cannot borrow your way to greatness. You can only borrow your way to servitude. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video.